Most people looking at the Canada-US trade fight think the story is simple. Washington raises tariffs, Canada retaliates, and the two sides keep escalating until somebody backs down, but that is no longer the strategy Canada is using. Over the past year, Canada has quietly moved away from broad, dollar-for-dollar retaliation and towards something much more calculated, keeping the wider trading relationship as stable as possible, giving up some leverage where it believes the cost is too high, and concentrating pressure on a smaller number of strategic disputes. And now Washington is facing a different kind of negotiating partner. Not a Canada that automatically responds to every tariff with another tariff, but a Canada willing to absorb political criticism at home in exchange for keeping access to the American market as intact as possible. That creates a fascinating question for investors, businesses, workers, and households on both sides of the border. Is Canada playing a long game that could eventually strengthen its position? Or is it giving away negotiating leverage without getting enough in return? Once you see the numbers, the incentives, and the strategy clearly, you'll understand why this matters far beyond one tariff deadline. To understand the change, you have to go back to the beginning of the trade conflict. When the United States imposed broad tariffs on Canadian imports in 2025, Canada's initial response was familiar: retaliate. If Washington placed a tariff on Canadian goods, Ottawa would respond with tariffs on American products. The logic was straightforward: make the economic cost visible to both sides, create pressure on American businesses, create political pressure inside the United States, and demonstrate that Canada would not simply accept whatever terms Washington imposed. For a while, that was the dominant strategy, but there was a structural problem hiding underneath it. Canada and the United States are not equal-sized economies. Canada's economy is roughly 1/10 the size of the American economy. That doesn't mean Canada has no leverage. It means the cost of a prolonged economic confrontation is not distributed equally. Imagine two households entering a financial dispute. One household earns 10 times what the other household earns. They may both be angry. They may both impose financial penalties on each other. But if the dispute lasts for years, the household with the larger income has a much greater ability to absorb the damage. That is essentially the strategic problem Canada faces. A tariff war can be politically satisfying while still being economically dangerous. And that realization appears to have influenced a strategy adopted under Prime Minister Mark Carney. Instead of trying to match every American action with an equal Canadian response, Ottawa began removing many of its retaliatory tariffs, while keeping pressure concentrated in areas it considered strategically important. That was a major change, and it immediately created two competing interpretations. Supporters could argue that Canada was being disciplined. Why fight a 10 times larger economy on every front when you can preserve the parts of the relationship that matter most? Critics could argue the opposite. If Canada removes its own tariffs before securing meaningful concessions from Washington, what negotiating leverage does it have left? That is not a theoretical disagreement. It goes directly to the economic future of Canadian manufacturers, exporters, farmers, workers, and consumers, and it also matters to American households because tariffs don't disappear simply because politicians announce them. They move through supply chains. A tariff can begin as a government policy and eventually appear as a higher input cost for a manufacturer, a higher wholesale price, a change sourcing decision, or a higher price paid by a consumer. That's why the real story isn't just what Trump says or what Carney says. The real story is how businesses respond. And this is where the numbers become important. The transcript describes the new U.S. tariff threat as potentially reaching 50% on certain Canadian goods, with the measures focused on specific disputes and categories. That sounds enormous, but a headline percentage doesn't tell you the complete economic impact. The first question is always, 50% of what? Which products? Which companies? Which exemptions? How long does the tariff remain? and how much of the additional cost gets absorbed by the exporter, the importer, or the final consumer. Suppose an American importer buys a Canadian product for $100. A 50% tariff, if fully applied to that transaction, could add $50 to the import cost. But the final consumer doesn't necessarily see a $50 price increase. The importer might absorb part of it. The Canadian exporter might lower its price. The American distributor might reduce its margin. The company might switch suppliers, or some combination of all four could happen. That's why tariffs are not simply taxes that move directly from Washington into the shopping cart. They're economic shocks that get distributed throughout a supply chain. And the longer they remain in place, the more businesses have an incentive to redesign that supply chain. That's where the long-term risk becomes more important than the headline. A temporary tariff is one thing. A business permanently deciding that it no longer wants to depend on a particular cross-border supplier is something else. Once factories, contracts, logistics networks, and sourcing relationships change, reversing those decisions can be expensive. That is why trade uncertainty can affect investment even before the full economic damage appears in official statistics. Businesses don't only ask, what is the tariff today? They ask, what will the tariff be 2 years from now? And that question is much harder to answer. This is where Canada's strategy becomes more interesting. Carney's approach appears to recognize that uncertainty itself has an economic cost. If Canada can reduce the number of active disputes, keep much of North American trade flowing, and preserve its strongest negotiating positions for the issues that matter most, it may limit the damage from a broader confrontation. In other words, the strategy isn't necessarily about winning every argument. It is about preventing every argument from becoming a war. That sounds less dramatic, but financially it can be more important. Because businesses value predictability. An American manufacturer deciding whether to expand a plant in Michigan doesn't necessarily need tariffs to be zero. It needs to know what the rules will look like after it invests hundreds of millions of dollars. A Canadian manufacturer faces the same problem. If the rules can change every few months, the value of waiting increases. And waiting can mean delayed investment. Delayed investment can mean slower productivity growth. Slower productivity can eventually affect wages and living standards. That is the chain most people don't see when they hear a politician announce another tariff. The tariff is the headline, investment is the consequence, and productivity is the long-term story. But here's where the tension gets much sharper, because patience only works if the other side eventually rewards it. This is where most people get caught. Imagine Canada removes a retaliatory tariff because it believes doing so will create room for negotiation. Then, Washington responds by saying the removal of that tariff was simply expected and demands additional concessions. Now Canada has a problem. It has given up one bargaining chip without necessarily receiving a comparable concession. Do that repeatedly, and the strategy can shift from selective compromise into something much less comfortable. It can become unilateral concession. That is the criticism coming from Canadian unions, opposition politicians, and other critics of the approach. And this is an important point because the criticism isn't necessarily that Canada should launch an unlimited trade war. The stronger criticism is more nuanced. If you're going to give something up, what are you getting in return? That question should be at the center of every negotiation, and it applies to households as well. Think about negotiating your own finances. If you're refinancing debt, you don't simply ask whether the new interest rate is lower. You ask about fees. You ask about the term. You ask whether the payment is fixed or variable. You ask what happens later. You look at the entire deal. Governments face the same principle at a much larger scale. A tariff concession is only valuable if the economic stability or market access gained in return is worth more than the leverage surrendered. That's why the current dispute is so difficult. Canada isn't choosing between fight and surrender. There is a much wider spectrum between those two extremes. and Canada's strategy appears to be operating somewhere in that middle. Now consider the two paths Canada could take. The first is the reactive path. Washington announces a tariff. Canada announces a counter-tariff. Washington escalates. Canada escalates again. The political messaging becomes stronger. Domestic audiences feel reassured that their government is fighting back. But every round increases the economic cost. Businesses face more uncertainty, consumers face more pricing pressure, and supply chains become harder to manage. The second path is the strategic path. Canada identifies the areas where it has genuine leverage. It keeps the broader trading relationship functioning wherever possible. It removes measures that create more domestic damage than strategic benefit, and it reserves its strongest negotiating position for areas where the long-term payoff is potentially larger. Neither path guarantees victory, but the second path is designed around a different objective. Not maximum retaliation, maximum economic resilience. And that distinction matters for ordinary people. If you're an American worker in manufacturing, tariffs could create opportunities if companies bring production home, but they can also raise the cost of imported components. If you're a Canadian manufacturing worker, the risk runs in the opposite direction. Reduced access to the American market can affect orders, production schedules, and investment decisions. If you're a household already dealing with higher living costs, the important question isn't which politician won the press conference. It's whether the final policy changes the prices you pay, and if you're an investor, uncertainty itself deserves attention. Companies with highly diversified supply chains may adapt more easily than companies dependent on one cross-border route. Companies with strong margins may absorb temporary costs better than companies operating with very little room. That is where the median household matters more than the average headline. A multinational corporation can potentially absorb a temporary shock that would be painful. For a small business operating on a thin margin, the same principle applies to households. A family with 6 months of emergency savings can respond to an unexpected price increase differently from a family that has no financial cushion. Economic resilience is partly about the size of the shock, but it is also about the size of the margin. And that brings us to the bigger economic consequence. Canada is trying to protect its access to the world's largest economy while simultaneously convincing investors that Canada remains a stable place to put capital. Those goals are connected. Investors don't only look at tax rates. They look at market access. They look at political stability. They look at infrastructure. They look at supply chains. And they look at whether the rules are predictable. A trade relationship that repeatedly shifts between escalation and de-escalation can make long-term planning harder. That creates a difficult political test for Carney. Every concession may help preserve economic stability, but every concession also creates an opportunity for critics to say Canada is giving Washington too much. That is the tension, and it becomes especially important in sectors like dairy and automobiles. Dairy is not simply a tariff dispute. Canada's dairy system is tied to domestic agricultural policy and regional politics. Autos are not simply another manufactured product. North American automobile production is deeply integrated across borders. A vehicle can involve components crossing the US-Canada border multiple times before the final product reaches a consumer. So a tariff applied to one part of that system can have effects far beyond the company that technically pays it. This is why the auto sector may become one of the most difficult pieces of the negotiation. And it's also why the upcoming review of the North American trade framework matters so much. The August deadline is important, but it may not be the end of the story. Even if Washington and Ottawa reach a temporary agreement, the larger question of how North American trade should operate is still waiting. And that means businesses cannot simply plan around one deadline. They have to think about the next agreement, the next review, the next administration, the next supply chain decision. This is where the long-term consequences become clear. Canada's strategic shift is essentially a bet. The bet is that preserving a functioning economic relationship with the United States is more valuable than maintaining every retaliatory measure. The risk is that Washington may interpret concessions not as goodwill, but as evidence that additional pressure works. If that happens, Canada could discover that patience has a limit. So what should businesses and households actually take away from this? First, don't treat a tariff headline as a prediction about consumer prices. Look at the product, look at the supply chain, look at the duration. Second, don't assume that every tariff will remain in place indefinitely. Trade negotiations can change the outcome quickly. Third, if your business depends heavily on cross-border trade, calculate your exposure. How much revenue comes from the other country? How much of your input cost comes from across the border? How quickly could you find another supplier? And how much margin do you have if costs rise? Fourth, if you're an investor, don't confuse political headlines with permanent economic outcomes. A 50% tariff headline may dominate today's news cycle, but the long-term question is whether companies actually relocate production, change suppliers, reduce investment, or pass costs to consumers. Those decisions matter more than the headline itself. Fifth, households should focus on the part they can control. If trade uncertainty contributes to higher prices, maintaining an emergency reserve becomes more valuable. If you're carrying expensive variable rate debt, reducing that vulnerability can be more useful than trying to predict the next political announcement. If you're nearing retirement, preserving flexibility in your spending plan can matter more than guessing exactly where tariffs will be 6 months from now. And if you're still working, remember that economic transitions create both risks and opportunities. Industries that lose competitiveness may cut investment. Other industries may expand. The important question is not simply, is the economy good or bad? It's, where is capital moving? That is the question strategic investors ask. And it is increasingly the question Canada has to answer, because the deeper story isn't really about whether Canada can win a tariff fight. It's about whether Canada can remain economically resilient while its largest trading partner changes the rules of the game. And that brings us back to the original question: did Washington expect Canada to change strategy? Perhaps the more important question is whether Washington understands what that strategy is trying to accomplish. Canada isn't necessarily trying to defeat the United States in a tariff war. It is trying to avoid needing to fight one. Those are very different objectives. And if the strategy succeeds, the victory may not produce a dramatic announcement. There may be no moment where one side declares total victory. Instead, success could look surprisingly boring. Factories keep operating, supply chains remain connected, investment continues, businesses gain more certainty, and consumers avoid another layer of unnecessary price pressure. That doesn't make for the most dramatic headline. But economically, boring can be extremely valuable. At the same time, Canada cannot afford complacency. A strategy based on selective concession only works if concessions are disciplined. Every major concession needs a reason. Every major compromise needs something durable in return. And every temporary promise needs to be evaluated against the possibility that the policy could change later. That is the part of the strategy worth watching most closely. Because if Canada can trade reversible concessions for reversible concessions while protecting its core interests, the strategy could prove more sophisticated than the early headlines suggested. But if Canada continues giving up leverage without receiving durable benefits, the criticism that it is simply buying time will become much harder to dismiss. For investors, businesses, and households, that uncertainty is the real story, not the next angry statement, not the next political headline. The real question is whether North America's economic structure is quietly changing. And if it is, where will the capital, factories, workers, and supply chains move next? That's what will ultimately determine who benefits and who pays. So as you watch the next stage of these negotiations, don't just ask which country appears stronger at the press conference. Ask a more useful question. Who is building the stronger economic position 5 years from now? Because trade policy is rarely decided by one announcement, its effects compound. A small change in investment here, a supplier change there, a factory delayed, a factory expanded, a new contract signed, a new market developed. Over several years, those decisions can reshape an economy far more dramatically than any single tariff announcement. And that is why Canada's strategic shift deserves attention. It may be a sign of weakness. It may be a sign of pragmatism, or it may be something in between, an attempt by a smaller economy to preserve as much flexibility as possible while negotiating with a much larger one. We don't know the final answer yet, and pretending that we do would be misleading, but we can watch the incentives, we can watch the investment, we can watch the supply chains, and we can watch what each side is willing to give up and what it receives in return. That is where the real story will be written. So what do you think? Is Canada's move away from broad retaliation a smart long-term strategy? Or is Ottawa giving away too much leverage in the hope that Washington eventually rewards restraint? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want more calm, data-driven analysis of the economic decisions shaping markets, trade, inflation, and household finances, consider subscribing. Because the biggest economic changes are often not the loudest ones. Sometimes the most important shift is the one that happens quietly, before most people realize the rules of the game have changed.